I wanted to introduce our speakers, and I'll do so in the order that they're going to come up one after the other. First of all, we're going to have Shep Bentley address the issue. And Shep, in my opinion, is a man of the international man of all things regulatory. By the way, his handle is FDA Guy. Okay, so he's also a member of OCRA. And I think one thing that I appreciate about Shep, he's actually served the U.S. military. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps, and he served both wars in Iraq, both in the one in the 1990s, right, Desert Storm, Desert Shield, and then the one after 9/11. So Shep is our first speaker. The next speaker is Allison Komiyama. Allison came to us from the FDA, where she was a reviewer. And you'll be interested to know that Allison, when she came back to the West Coast after she left the FDA, had several jobs in the regulatory field for various companies. And she was ready to join a very large San Diego-based life sciences company in a regulatory capacity. And both the company and Allison were really looking forward to it. And the day Allison shows up for the job, the company tells her her job's no longer there. So Allison turns around and decides to start her regulatory consulting practice, and now employs, I believe, 6 or 7 regulatory professionals in the field. So she brings a perspective both from the FDA and from the regulatory side. And then we have Jesse Kryger. Jesse comes to us through a different pathway, even though very tightly associated with the FDA as well. He comes from a quality perspective. So as you know, medical device companies, pharma companies, they need to manufacture, they need to design. It's all very tightly controlled, quality management systems. And Jesse's whole career has been around those kind of systems. He works now for I call it a contractor kind of HR company that places consultants, and he uses his talents to help them enter the market here in the US around the regulatory field. So that's a brief introduction to everybody. Again, I'd like to make sure that everybody asks the questions as they come up. We're, like I said, we're going to do a half an hour or so, or we'll see where it brings us with the introductions, and then we'll open up for everybody to for open conversation amongst each other. All right, Shep, you're up first.
Well, I'm going to take Piet up on his invitation to make this as comfortable and interactive as possible within the constraints that we have from the technology, the audio-visual constraints. Hopefully this will work really well, because the idea is that we're able to communicate with really answering questions in real time throughout this presentation, so that I'm not just blathering on about my limited perspective on how COVID-19 is affecting affairs in the United States at a particular moment. So I do take you as you're presenting the questions to me as a real opportunity to provide you specific information. I just want to start the context of the conversation by saying that you know, in this year, the FDA has been presented with a challenge like no other. And you know, the FDA is not much older than a century. We only had a pandemic like this about a century ago, and at that time the FDA was in its infancy. What this pandemic represents right now in terms of being a public emergency is an opportunity for amazing innovation, and that's what the FDA has been dealing with right now, is looking at the innovations that have been coming in terms of responses to the pandemic in equipment, in respirators and resuscitators, and nebulizers and ventilators, in terms of IVDs, technology to diagnostic devices. I promise not to use that. Things that help us to understand the dimensions of this pandemic, how to protect ourselves as individuals from the the likelihood of catching COVID-19 all the way to treating those that are facing the symptoms of COVID-19. So this is, and everything in between, this has been an amazing opportunity in life sciences to respond to something like no other. And I can tell you that at the beginning of 2020, the FDA was not anticipating having to organize itself in this way. And yet I think it has done an amazing job in mobilizing itself to respond. We thought in, I would say, approximately March of 2020 that this emergency would be perhaps short-lived. And there was even talk in June of ending the emergency. I can say now that there's no end in sight. There's certainly not going to be an end to the emergency that's declared in 2020. And it's very likely that this emergency will be in place for years, not a matter of several more months. So what I wanted to mention is that there's a few of us here that have been approached to take technologies forward in front of the FDA and try to discern how best to interact with the emergency use authorization review staff, those lucky individuals at the FDA that are tasked with evaluating if what is being presented to them is actually adequate to deal with the specific indications that it's being applied for this pandemic. And I can tell you that the early days were very, very chaotic. I mean, it seemed like everyone was facing an absence of forms, an absence of templates, an absence of proper ways of conveying information. And the regulators were in, I would say, overdrive and working long shifts, 14-hour shifts, 7 days a week in some cases, in order to figure out how best to organize the information that was being presented to them and evaluate it and turn around and make it a quick decision as to whether or not this would be useful in battling the pandemic. Since the middle of March until today, in the last week of August, I can tell you that there's been an amazing amount of effort to organize and systematize and regulate the information and make decisions in terms of how best to provide the public with I would say, diagnostic and therapeutic authorized products that will be effective in actually helping people overcome the challenges of this particular situation. So what I'm here to do is to help people without further ado in understanding what it is to approach the FDA. What's the best information? What are the best tips, the best tricks, the best ways of proceeding with novel technologies, or even just things that haven't been available at the level or the rate that they could otherwise be available, in order to help all of us to reach the end of this crisis.
I do have a question, but I don't quite understand the question from Ari Shen.
Okay.
And it's addressed to you. He says, how does the software discriminate between tests that are not accepted by the intended recipient of the test outcome? Ari, if you could kind of further explain that to us, then I think we can answer that. But right now, I don't quite understand what is meant here. Do you, Shep?
Well, when you're saying the software, are you talking about artificial intelligence, perhaps, or are you talking about?
I don't know. So
Okay.
let Ari answer that for us, and then we'll go from there. And anything you want to add to what you just mentioned already, Shep?
Yeah, actually, okay. So while people are still cogitating, I'll be happy to continue the effort to frame the discussion a bit. Basically, what I want to mention is that back in the spring, which seems like already a long, long time ago, we were facing, I would say, the big question: if I proceed to the FDA and I've got something that I want to the public in terms of battling the pandemic as a technology or whatnot, how much time do I have to plan for? And we were hearing turnaround times of something like 36 hours or a few days. Back then, the evaluations were going extremely quickly, and the idea that there was urgency in the emergency at that time. We're facing alternatives of nothing. If you didn't get this particular thing through and into the hands of those that needed it, they might not have anything else to work with. And so we're all looking at, what could be helpful, what could be beneficial clinically at that particular time. And what's interesting is that in the intervening several months now, things have been more difficult in terms of predicting, how quickly could we expect the FDA to turn around a review, or be interactive as they originally set up to be. Some of the things that have affected the ability of the FDA to be as interactive as they would otherwise like to be has been the volume of submissions for emergency use authorization. And that volume has been not dozens, but hundreds, in some cases thousands of submissions, because the idea has been that the FDA is now offering this emergency use authorization pathway, and that's going to naturally be faster than doing it the usual way. Well, it reminds me of back when I used to go to the airport, and I haven't done that for quite a long time. You would see, well, if you get into the pre-check, the TSA pre-check lane, that would typically be faster. So if the idea is that you're going to bypass the conventional approach by getting into this line, you're necessarily going to get to the gate a lot faster. And then, as trends would have it, typically people say, oh, I want to go faster. So the line for pre-check would be actually sometimes 10 times longer than the line for the conventional TSA check. So that's my analogy for everyone to understand. Basically, there's an enormous line, the enormous queue for emergency use authorization review in almost everything. And in some cases, the people that are organized to do the standard review, the normal routine reviews, are able to do that with less of a queue and are able to be more interactive right now, which is sort of an unanticipated set of circumstances, but it also follows people's desire to go through quickly.
Shep, the technical folks at ULP tell me that your connection is quite unstable, and they suggested that you disconnect and reconnect with us. In the meantime, I'm going to put up another poll. Sam, are you able to put up the second poll for us? And Shep, when you come back, you'll come back in, or we'll ask Allison to continue. Okay.
Okay. Maybe if I cut my video, that might help.
So let's do the next poll here. A little bit about your company, where you're at, basically, and what is it you do?
That's you, Allison.
No, I thought, wait, were you asking a poll?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, Shep, you made my eyes like go this big.
Sorry.
Like, wait.
So we got the answer to the poll here. Oh, and a majority of the folks are consultants on the line, actually 40%. Okay, so I presume we will have a lot of people that know a lot about regulatory on the line as well. But we do have a fair amount, 13% of startups, established life sciences companies, 23%. So, and a number of entrepreneurs. So we got a nice mix for us to talk to, and we'll make sure we address everybody in at the appropriate level. We won't go too deep into the regulatory stuff. Thank you, Sam. Okay, Allison, I think maybe you could jump in since Shep is redoing his connection, and I'll let you take the floor.
All right. Can you hear me all right, Pete? Thumbs up. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Allison Komiyama. Thanks so much for the intro, Pete. Yeah, it was kind of a shocker when I lost my job offer, but then turned that around pretty quickly, and I sat for about 24 hours and then said, I think I could be a consultant and I should just start my own company. So the rest is kind of history. After that, I felt like it was 2014, and I felt that, hey, if I give this a try for a couple months and I fail miserably, I will find a job and go back into industry. So Fortunately, my job in consulting now really allows me to stay in touch with a lot of really cool medical device companies, and also in touch with a lot of my friends who are still at FDA. So a lot of the submissions that we send to the agency are reviewed by folks that I worked with. And so not that they give me any special treatment, but I will say it's been really fun to get to be part of yeah, just the technological advances that are going through FDA. So I actually, I cheated, Pete. I did make some slides, and I got permission to show them up on the slide, on the screen. So if you'll allow me, I'm gonna just try and share. Let's see if this allows it. Let's see, slideshow. Pete, I can see you. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen? I can't hear you because you're muted, but I can see you.
You're good, Allison.
Okay, you can see it, Karen? Thank you. So yeah, I only had a couple slides, and more was, just based on, if everyone thought like 2019 was miserable, and, there were so many bad things that happened, and then, 2020 came along, and I kind of feel like, wow, this is, grab your popcorn and, settle in, because we're in for a wild ride, especially with regard to regulations. So as Shep mentioned earlier, this isn't the first pandemic we've seen, or epidemic. FDA has been really involved with, they have a long history of trying to prevent pandemics and epidemics from spreading. I think what's a little different here than what we saw in the 80s and 90s is that, as soon as something was, as soon as HIV/AIDS was declared as an epidemic, it took a year for them to actually come up with a test kit, right? So the HIV test kit was on March 4th, 1985 that FDA finally released. I mean, what we've seen FDA do is pretty astounding. There have been treatments, there have been emergency use authorizations, the amount of technology being thrown at FDA, but also FDA backing and supporting. Some of them haven't worked so well, but for the most part, it's been pretty shocking to see how fast they've been able to turn things around and at least get testing to people who need to be tested. Of course, there are a lot of failures, as I mentioned, but the fact that it didn't take a whole year, that, we have the technology to, at least be able to test people within a few days and get results back. It just kind of speaks to how far we've come, I would say, in the past 20, 30, 40 years. And I'm, one to point out that, yes, there are limitations in FDA. They are a government agency, so there are things that seem to be very slow with, getting things authorized or getting things through in a regulatory fashion with the agency, but still, we have to hand it to them that they are working super hard. And as Shep mentioned, many, many hours during the day. We've been getting more emails from FDA on the weekends at midnight. I can tell that they're working from home and things haven't slowed down for them. So the other thing to notice is that this has been a really shocking time of guidance documents. FDA, they typically will put out a list of strategic priorities for guidance documents every year, and they call it the A list and the B list, and the priority list as resources will allow. But this year, and this was from the other day, there have now been 53 new guidance documents that have come out since March that have the word COVID in the title. Anything from digital health guidance documents to, there was one guidance document that was on how to reprocess cooling containers that were, or refrigerating containers that were dead bodies have been stored. What is the best process to repurpose those and to clean them and disinfect them so that they can be used again for their original purpose of moving food and other materials in cooled tanks. So as you can tell, it's been a pretty wild ride. It's very difficult to get guidance documents through the agency, and to have 53 of them in such a short period of time is pretty impressive. The other thing I want to talk about is, for a lot of the smaller startup companies out there, one of the methods to really get in front of FDA and have a discussion with them is this pre-submission process. And this slide, I'm sorry, it's a bit wordy, but this is from an actual letter from FDA that was received a couple weeks ago from another consultant. She shared it with me, and she said, "Oh my gosh, we've just been canceled," and they had submitted a pre-sub to FDA, and FDA said, "Listen, we have received over 2,000 pre-emergency use authorizations. We're too busy, therefore we're notifying you that your Q-sub is closed," and they decided not to review it and not have a teleconference call with this company. So just keep in mind that things are, we are seeing the ripple effect of coronavirus just really impacting all of the different branches at FDA. People are being deployed to different groups at the agency, and also they're starting to cancel some of the non-essential pre-submissions if that specific branch of the agency is too heavily impacted. So yeah, so again, these are the guidance documents, as I mentioned, the A list and B list. Some of the ones I'm about to show you have not been on this list. Clearly it was because of COVID, but I think these are really interesting for small startup companies because we have quite a few companies that are using that may have remote monitoring device capabilities. And so FDA put a guidance document out saying, listen, if you already have a cleared device and you want to expand your indications, or there is, you could add a Bluetooth chip to your device and have it be remote monitoring, this guidance document is for you. So they actually updated it. So as you can tell, it was from March, was the first one that was released, and they updated it again in June. And what they updated is the first guidance document had, 8 different regulations where they said, okay, these are the only devices that apply in this guidance document. And then they updated it and added a couple more. So you can see that they're really interested in being able to remotely monitor patients from afar. So I think that's very telling of, not only adoption for patients and hospitals getting used to telehealth and having patients stay home if they don't need to come in, but also, for industry saying, okay, this is something that we, should consider for our technology or our device. So here's some examples of it. Vital Patch, they got an emergency use authorization, but also this company called Koala Life, they put out, they expanded their indications for remote monitoring capabilities as well. Another guidance document was for digital health devices that treat psychiatric disorders. So this was an interesting one for a lot of regulatory folks because FDA essentially said, listen, even if you don't have FDA clearance of your device, we're open to having you start marketing your device and selling it even without 510K or de novo, because we believe the benefits outweigh the risks, because there are folks staying at home and they have psychiatric disorders and they are unable to get the treatment or in-person care that they deserve and need. So if you have a medical device that can help, you are welcome to start marketing it, and we will not come down on you. This is going to be under enforcement discretion. So some of the devices, if you're familiar with Paratherapeutics up in the Bay Area, this was a product code PWE. There's now one for insomnia, for substance use disorders, anything that's in the DSM-5. FDA is willing to review those or not review those devices, essentially have you go to market. So anyway, I will stop sharing now. And yeah, I just think that this is a really amazing time to be in regulatory affairs. We're, watching things change in real time, and everyone's like, oh, I can't wait to get back to normal, and I can't wait to, have this be over. And I keep saying, we are never going back to that normal. We're going to see regulations, as I've just demonstrated with these guidance documents. It's going to be hard to, get the cat back in the bag after this. It's really, things have changed, and FDA will come out the other end of this as an evolved agency, and all of us need to be very ready to see how the regulatory landscape will have changed at that point. So anyway, thank you for letting me share some slides. Happy to take any questions.
Are there any questions right now? We have a question. Ari will come online, I think, later on. And Kenny Tran, Kenny, you had a question. Can we put you on the microphone real quick? Sam?
He should be able to talk. He just needs to unmute himself.
Okay. Kenny, can you unmute yourself? Okay. We'll wait till Kenny is back on. I do have a question here. How is the FDA now addressing unannounced inspections? Well, I think that's a very good question, and that's a question I think for Jesse. So, Jesse, why don't you take that question, introduce yourself, and give us a little bit of an overview from your perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you, Pete. I'll be happy to answer that question. I think it will play right into what I wanted to discuss today as a challenge in the area of supply chain. But before I get into that, I would like to do a brief introduction of myself just to expand a little bit on the context of where I'm coming from in the industry. So as I were introduced, I am Jesse, and I'm a VP. I'm the VP of Quality Systems and Regulatory Compliance for PTS Advance. I am also a consultant for manufacturer of medical products. I specialize in the deployment, integration, and remediation of quality systems. And as Pete said earlier, that includes areas of focus, including design, controls, manufacturing, and supply chain operations. I have 15 years experience working with a lot of leading medical firms who manufacture a range of products from AEDs to neurovascular guide wires, orthopedic implants, and patient imaging products. So I got kind of a good feel of many different medical devices in the industry. I also have my MBA, and I'm a doctorate student, and I hold several industry-leading certifications, and among those include several with the American Society for Quality, including my Six Sigma Black Belt, my quality engineering, auditing, and management certifications. So it's definitely been a passion of mine to focus on growing my education in this area and applying that with the companies I work with. So that being said, I am privy to a lot of the organizational challenges that we're facing and some of the recent changes initiated by the FDA. One particular change I wanted to bring to this forum, and I think, again, this will play into the question, is what is FDA's position on the market authorization and facility registration inspections? This is whether you're going through a PMA process and having your first inspection or subsequent surveillance and recertification inspections thereafter in this new pandemic landscape. So, some background on that is that the FDA did temporarily suspend on-site audits. And that I know one of my clients that I'm working with was in the middle of an FDA audit in most of March, but pretty much since March through the summer, the FDA had stopped inspections. Now, in July, they did announce that they were resuming those inspections, primarily with a focus on high-risk Class 3 devices. Now, with that being said, the FDA has long been trying to streamline its processes. And as we've seen in the pandemic, that's only accelerated this initiative. And with that being said, I want to turn direction to a little bit of what the FDA refers to as MDSAP. MDSAP is the Medical Device Single Audit Program. And it started some years ago. It was first piloted, and then it was rolled out with the certification to the latest version of the ISO 13485 standard. That's from 2016. So as companies went to recertify to 13485, the medical device standard for quality management systems, they were going through the MDSAP program. Now, MDSAP was created to, again, streamline and reduce the number of inspections that companies were going through. This was in part to harmonize with regulations, not only of the FDA, but also of other countries. So it does serve the purpose of taking a company who's in multiple markets from 5 audits to 1 audit that satisfies the needs of the FDA, your ISO certification, and some other countries, including Canada and Japan and Brazil. Now, with that, there is a structured approach for how this MDSAP audit works. And this is how we were able to satisfy in the industry 1 audit fits all. And so it never really was designed to be a remote audit. It requires, yes, it has some document review in the initial phase, but it always required a subsequent on-site audit. Now, in January of this year, the FDA, in partnership with the MDSAP program, had started to pilot a remote version of the audit. Well, in actuality, it was really only a piece. It's still required on site. So it was the intent to start to explore the options and the opportunities to get into a remote landscape. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, this being perpetuated by the pandemic, it was in July that the FDA announced that they would permit full remote MDSAP audits. Now, that definitely comes with some challenges. Anybody in the audience who has participated in audits, there's certainly a challenge to try to accomplish the on-site portion virtually. So that is definitely a challenge being felt by the industry right now, and in multiple ways. And in one way, it's a strain on the company to effectively host the MDSAP audit. It requires a significant amount of planning to prepare, especially in regards to the technology. And some of the clients I've worked with, how we've used cameras as we take a tour in the facility. And there's a lot of key learnings there, and a lot of ways that if we prepare well and have a well-functioning team, luckily for myself and some companies I've worked with, we did a lot of preparation for on-site audits that played into us being effective for remote audits. But there's also another aspect to this whole thing, where companies also experience this new territory, and that's really with their own supply chain. So what we're finding too is companies are met with challenge to onboard and qualify and even perform continuous monitoring of their suppliers, their contract manufacturers they work with. It puts a strain on our ability to select suppliers, qualify their processes, develop those processes, as well as perform audits on those suppliers where travel restrictions are imposed. This whole situation too is also being perpetuated by recent incentives to reshore or even start up new products. And this plays into a lot of what Allison and Shep had talked about with the emergency use authorizations that are being permitted. And this is also being perpetuated by the recent executive order by the president earlier this month, mandating more manufacturing of medical products here in the US. Now, how that really plays out is that if we give incentive or priority for manufacturers in the US, if there is streamlined processes, that's going to incentivize companies to come and reshore their products here. And in addition to that, we've also seen a number of grants, government grants issued, and a lot of other actions there. And I think we're going to continue to see a lot of that play out. And those are significant supply chain changes, and it requires a lot of work that is challenging or met with challenge when we're trying to do that all virtually. So in sum, there's certainly a lot of streamlining going on in the FDA. They haven't entirely endorsed remote audits, and they still are doing the unannounced audits. And as part of the July announcement for permitting MDSAP audits on a remote, like a full remote basis, part of that caveat or the follow-up requirement there is that you would have to have an on-site audit within the next year. And so we're working under the assumption that we'll eventually get out of this pandemic, and then we'll be having to perform those on-site audits at a later date.
Got you. Thank you, Jesse. So since we all had a turn, I suggest we open it up for everybody. Please also, if the audience has questions, forward them either under the QA box or the chat box. I'll pick them up and I'll make sure they get asked. To start off with, maybe another quick poll, if we could, Sam. So we're wondering whom of you is planning to go for marketing approval here. And then the next question, after you answer this one, is what time frame are you considering to go and ask your approval? Is it going to be the next year, which is probably still under COVID, right? Or is it going to be in the distant future? Oh, quite a few people going. So that's quite interesting. And then the next question, the next poll, if we could, Sam, asks about the time frame. And I guess those people that answered no, they put in never. Oh, wow, quite a few people going right away. And then 6 months, that adds up to at least 50%. That's fast. So our panelists now know that we're looking short term here. And I have a last poll, and we could put that up right away as well, which asks you whether your products are COVID related or not. So I'm curious to that as well. Oh, half of them are COVID related, almost half of them. That's a fair amount of COVID related products. So let's start with a first question, right? So obviously, if you're making a diagnostic, a COVID diagnostic, it's very, very clearly related to COVID. But there's no questions about it. There's an EU, there's an emergency authorization for that. We all know that. But I think there's products out there that are a little bit more, how would I say it, moldable, right? Where you can make it work with COVID if you try. And for some, if you try really, really hard, you can make it work with COVID. What's your kind of suggestion, right? How hard do you push? How much do you try to make it fit the COVID narrative to get it through emergency authorization to the market? If you guys could just quickly address that issue. Allison, yeah, please, everybody gets off the
I'm like,
mute, right?
Shep gonna unmute first. We're both like, I would say, there are a lot of companies that have approached us and say, hey, this, my device is the answer to COVID, and I want to, completely pivot, and we're gonna, take this on, and we're gonna be the way that kids get back to school, and that, people get back to work. And it's going to take us about 2 years to, get all the data that we need to demonstrate that this is effective. But that's okay, right? We can get an emergency use authorization. And the answer is no. FDA has really prioritized the things that are very rapidly scalable, that are ready to go now. And, they really want companies who fit the declaration, meaning like is it going to help diagnose, treat, mitigate COVID? There have been a few devices that have made it through emergency use authorization that are either screening tools, but still, what it has to accomplish is that it has to help with the pandemic. I had a company that said, listen, we can do a diagnostic test for something very, very non-COVID related, but we can, do this test from home, and it's going to be, what a great thing to have, so people don't have to go to the doctor to get this test. It's for a female pelvic exam type test, and can we get this through an emergency use authorization? And I said, not unless you can also, test for COVID while you're in there and sending the sample in. You really have to. Just because it's a great tool for a remote monitoring device, or for something that is totally unrelated to COVID, it's a great idea, but FDA says submit a 510K or submit your de novo, like they're still reviewing all the pre-market submissions. And their priority is to, of course, promote and protect public health, but just trying to throw COVID into the name to make it sell, don't want to be seen as a pandemic profiteer, and you just really want to be careful with what you're marketing and what you want to go to market with ultimately. I'd love Shep's take on this too, because I know we both have some stories.
Shep, can you mute yourself?
Can you?
Shep?
All right.
Yeah, great.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Shoot. Trying not to get feedback. Is that working? Okay. So basically, I'm working with companies that have had things in development for years. They'd never heard of COVID, and suddenly now COVID is their focus because it might have some effect. One that comes to mind is a defibrillator where, hey, people that are experiencing COVID, sometimes they have fibrillation. And so let's get an emergency use authorization in place for that. I mean, it might be beneficial, but the idea was that this was not intended originally for anything to do with COVID. It's just that people that are suffering from COVID-19 be facing something to do with that particular indication. So there's this idea of leveraging the pandemic for ease of entry into the market is certainly commonplace. I'm seeing that with a lot of companies where the original thought had zero to do with the pandemic. Could you hear me okay?
Yeah, you break up from time to time, Shep, but I guess we're going to have to live with that. I have another question, really kind of on the side, or Jesse and I talked a little bit about it. The folks at Tesla were able to bring the ventilators to market, right? Within 30 days from, I guess, when the ventilators were put on emergency use authorization. How does that work actually, and can that still work? Can a company still make that happen?
Yes, Pete. Yeah, this is a good question. So, as many are familiar, the government has invoked the Emergency Defense Act. So that's taking some companies who are not medical device manufacturers themselves, and in turn, having them become manufacturers of medical devices. So Tesla is a good example. I think, and again, this is under the emergency use authorization that allows these companies to come together. And why do we choose manufacturers of cars? I think it makes sense that, they work with a lot of similar components and materials that we do, and they are experienced with complex assemblies, but this is a different regulated landscape. And so, we did touch on Tesla before, but I think it's important to, kind of compare what's going on between GM and Tesla. So General Motors, they partnered with Ventec, and essentially what they've done, it comes out to being somewhat of an extension of their manufacturing. And they've already announced as well that their intent to return that manufacturing back to Ventec after the government contract is complete. Now Tesla, and maybe this is Tesla being Tesla, I mean, we couldn't expect anything less, but they did take a more innovative approach. From changing the software and the interface to the patient. And so down the road, it will be interesting to see if Tesla will choose to go forward in this industry. And under emergency use authorization, I think it's really important to note that that does exempt you from some requirements that we would usually be accustomed to in this industry. So with new design, that does put you under design controls that are prescribed by the FDA. So if Tesla does choose to bring their product to market, they will certainly at some point down the road have to look at how do they bring their systems and processes into compliance with the quality system regulation. GM's tact is we're an extension of manufacturing. We were able to do this under this EUA, and we'll roll that back to the company. And Tesla, it's interesting with their new developments, it will either need to go into a medical device company or eventually these emergency use authorizations will expire and you will be expected to adopt a quality system regulation.
Yeah.
And so either you'll be remediating or looking at how you transition into the market.
Yeah, that's a very good point, right? So the emergency use authorizations are all valid during the emergency. Once the emergency is over, basically it's done. You can't sell under that emergency use authorization anymore. And then what happens? Allison, Shep, what should people prepare for? And when should they start preparing for? If they have a emergency use authorization, suppose you have one today, what should I be worrying about?
Well, I can tell you, hang on. Okay, I can tell you right now that the concern that we're nearing the end of the emergency is not something to be worried about. I've had lengthy conversations with people that are on the emergency use authorization review staff. They've been told to tell us, the submitters, that we're going to be given months of advance warning before there's any end to the emergency. So the idea that we're past the halfway point of this emergency, I think is a myth. I would imagine, on the basis of what I understand right now from the FDA, that we're probably not even 10% of the way through what will be the emergency in hindsight. This will probably go on for years.
Yeah, and we have experience, right? Other emergency use authorizations are still in place, I believe. Allison, do you know of some of those?
Yeah, so I know for like anthrax, I believe there's some still in place for Ebola, and for the SARS-MERS outbreaks. So, I mean, if anthrax is still, under EUA, you can tell that coronavirus will be as well.
Yeah, for a while at least, yeah.
Right.
I have a question here from the audience. A person asks, COVID test, diagnostic, screening, surveillance. Are there different rules or guidelines in terms of regulatory and submission?
Yeah, so it definitely comes down to your claims and your indications, right? For I can think of the thermal screening devices, right? So if you have the thermometer or the infrared cameras that can tell if someone has a low-grade fever when they're walking into a building, that's clearly not a diagnostic device, right? It's not telling you that yes, you have coronavirus or you have a SARS-CoV-2 infection, but they are useful, right? And especially FDA has a whole website there. They put a whole link up about using those infrared cameras. For diagnostic devices, yes, I mean, FDA wants you to have the appropriate testing to generate, what is your positive predictive value, negative predictive value, what's your sensitivity, specificity of your device. And they are, while they've loosened the regulations because they do want to get additional testing out there, you definitely have to demonstrate that it is effective and you're not just, selling snake oil. So yes, I would say it goes back to your claims, what you're saying your device can do, and then backing up the claims.
Yeah.
Now,
a lot of people may have the idea, or I at one time thought, emergency use authorization, right? We'll quickly put it through, but it isn't that way, right? It's pretty strict. You've got to have all your ducks in a row before you even go there. And it seems to take longer than a lot of people expect. So should you go 510K instead?
And say that it's been a very dynamic situation, and when people come up and they say, how long is it going to take? you know, what's the plan? You know, is it going to take weeks, months, whatever? It depends on when in the cycle that, or in this process that the question is being asked. It's not something that you can plan with precision. And people that say you can plan this with precision are not interacting with the reality of the review. So there have been new guidances, just as what Allison was pointing out, within a very short space of time, things that have replaced guidances that where I would say the ink wasn't even dry on the previous guidance, and now suddenly we're looking at fundamentally, you know, more detail. And so the idea of being able to plan with precision is just not a good one. The idea is just to make sure that you can anticipate. I say, look at the trend and try to anticipate what will likely be the question criteria at the time that you're actually completing the evaluation. And if you're looking at specifically what was published on July 29th or whatever, you're probably missing elements of information to get your emergency use authorization.
Allison, I'm sure you have some experiences with putting these EUAs through, right? And about how prepared people really have to be. And maybe there's a mismatch between what they're expecting and what they really need to do.
Right, so FDA has put together guidance on what you need to do. I mean, they have been very, you know, fast about putting guidance out and trying to make sure it's, you know, as Shep said, the ink, you know, sometimes not even dry. We've seen typos in some of these guidance documents where usually it goes through so many levels at FDA before they release anything. I mean, for example, with regard to your question of EUAs, there are templates, right? There are actual template documents that they put out and say, listen, fill in this template as best you can and then send it in to us. And they want you to send, you know, the Word document because they call it a dynamic document that they want to work on with you. And so they'll ask additional questions, you'll send responses, and it would, you know, they take it over and help populate everything, but they really want, you know, to keep the process as fast as possible to get the technology through the EUA process. They've been very responsive.
Yeah. So, but even though it's an interactive process, it may not necessarily be interactive in the way that I would understand it. Like, I'll throw some mud against the wall and the FDA will come back and I get to do it again and again till finally we find something that works.
Right, they're not here to help you design with your design controls and help you figure out what your device is supposed to look like and the indications and the claims that you want for your device. You know, you really need to take ownership of your product, you know, make sure that you are the expert in your device. You know, FDA will tell you if they don't agree with something that you're promoting or, you know, something that needs to be changed in the labeling or the indications. But I would not rely on FDA to be your subject matter expert.
Right. Now for the EUA, I understand, well, for a 510K and all that, there's a pre-sub there. You can have a meeting with the FDA ahead of time. Can you do the same thing on a EUA? Can you do something like a pre-sub with them?
Sure. I mean, there's nothing keeping you from submitting a pre-submission, and there is the PEUA process or the pre-emergency use authorization process. A lot of times, companies will submit an EUA and it will get immediately kicked into the PEUA channel, so FDA can evaluate it quickly and triage it, you know, to decide whether or not they actually are going to review it. But there is nothing keeping you from doing a pre-submission. And, you know, getting FDA's feedback on your product.
And do those?
I would even.
Yeah, go ahead, Shep.
I would even submit that that is actually recommended, is to do the pre-EUA, or they call it PEUA. You get a PEUA number before you get your EUA number, and all that number indicates is that there's a place for the information to go and reside as you're developing your information file. With the review staff, and they understand, okay, this is not ready for prime time yet, but this is in discussion, and then they can sequence it more properly for ease of evaluation and authorization.
Yeah. So we have quite a few of companies on the line that actually have a COVID product, and that want to get it through the system in the next 6 months or faster. What are their options? Obviously, they could try to get emergency use authorization. Are there any other options that they should consider?
I would say that the speed of the EUA is a bit of a, it might have been more relevant 6 months ago. I'd say right now the speed of an EUA is not as attractive if that's the attraction. If it's speed to market, it might be even advisable to take a routine approach and go through a pre-market notification, go through a 510K process rather than rely on emergency use authorization. The emergency use authorization connotes speed because of the term emergency, but at the same time, be bogged down. I offer that analogy of the TSA pre-check. I mean, it's, the idea that it's going to be faster because it should be faster. It's not staffed to be that much faster right now. It could actually be slower.
Yeah. I have a question from the audience. They're asking, once the EUA once the emergency is over, right? And you got your emergency use authorization, you got all these products out there. What happens? Do you have to retract them? What happens?
Once the emergency is over, the authorization is over.
So
full stop.
You gotta get them back, those products? You gotta recall them?
You have to get them back. It's just a matter that you're not selling product past the emergency. The authorization is to get is to deal with the emergency as declared.
So if you ship them to a distributor, the distributor can sell them, or they can't sell them, or what?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
So I'm a manufacturer. I made these devices. I sold them to a distributor. They're in the distributor's warehouse. Now what happens? And the emergency authorization disappears, right? What happens with those devices?
I'm fairly certain there will be details and instructions that will be put out towards the end.
We don't know.
There won't be one afternoon, that the emergency is suddenly ended and everyone's caught off guard. Is what the FDA has explained is that it will be a months-long process of putting out the word that the emergency is in the process of ending.
Yeah,
so if anyone was taken off guard by that.
Yeah, we're starting to kind of see this. So there was a, sorry, Shep, I can't tell if you're still talking. There was a blanket EUA for the shields, essentially patient shields it was like a bubble that would go around the patient so the physician could be protected while perhaps they intubated the patient. And FDA had allowed a blanket authorization, and they recently took away the authorization and saying only ones that have negative pressure are still under the authorization. Otherwise, stop selling the ones that are just the housing unit because there might be there was some evidence that there might be risks associated with just the shield itself. And in that letter, they do define what their expectations are. Essentially saying, listen, if you've already put these out in the field, we're not telling you to recall them and bring them all back in. And we just don't want you to continue selling them. I think, as Shep said, we're going to get more information as the pandemic goes on and as the declaration is still underway. I think FDA has even said, we intend to provide additional guidance to as we move forward with this. And yeah, I think once the authorization is over, it's in your best interest to use whatever real world evidence that you've collected perhaps during the pandemic and during the use of your device in support of a pre-market submission, right? At that point, get your de novo and get your 510K and get your device cleared or granted, and that way there won't be that lapse, as soon as the pandemic's over, or as soon as the declaration is over. For software devices, I've heard of a lot of companies saying, what we've done is we've made it so as soon as the declaration is over, we'll roll out a new version of the software as a medical device, and that way, people won't be able to upgrade to the next version, and it, will be made obsolete. So there's certain ways that you can roll back without, pulling things out of people's homes and off of the shelves in hospitals.
I'd like to grow on what you're saying, Allison. As far as these emergency use authorizations do often permit you to bypass certain regulations, and that's part of the is what is interesting about them. So you can get through without a quality system regulation, for example. But I would just advocate, and it seems like this is a cause for us to pay attention to this, knowing that the EUA will eventually end. It would be in our best interests to establish a quality system, even if we weren't required to do so under the EUA. And that's in part just because of the benefits of having one. Because ultimately, even though it seems like it is a burden to implement a quality management system compliant with the FDA's quality system regulations, it is geared towards establishing how we can consistently produce products that meet our specifications. And depending whatever your end goal is as a business, I think the industry has learned not only from EUAs, but even 510Ks who don't require that pre-approval inspection by the FDA. There is some wiggle room on what you present to the FDA there, and it allows some companies to proceed or bring their product to market without a very mature quality system. And later down the road, if your interest is to sell your business and it becomes a part of a merger or an acquisition, I find a lot of companies, big companies, are taking a much deeper look at that due diligence of what is the quality system established, because it's bit some companies if you had not thoroughly gone through and established your design specifications, your manufacturing processes, your supplier selection. Because what happens is if you don't really take care of that over time, it becomes a big mess. And that's when the FDA comes in finally and does perform an inspection on your facility, finds you out of compliance, and through escalation, you might find yourself with citations, warning letters, consent decrees, forced shutdowns, and mass remediations. And usually those take several years to get out of because of its lack of following quality system regulation over the course of many years.
Say, Jesse, so not only do you have the FDA coming and inspecting your quality system, right, but you as a manufacturer, you got to make sure your suppliers kind of live up to their bargain or to the bargain as well. How do you do that in a time of COVID? How does that work?
Very good question, Pete. The finished device manufacturer is required to register their facility and their products they manufacture with the FDA. Their subcomponent contract manufacturers are not required to be registered with the FDA. However, by extension of your manufacturing, your responsibility, they have to comply with the regulation. So, and really essentially in regulation for supplier purchasing controls is to establish your requirements, to communicate those requirements, and demonstrate that your suppliers met those requirements. And, the medical device industry at large has really struggled with this. I see trends where the FDA has thrown out the old adage of we could accept products on CFC, which is a certification of conformity. We can't just take that your word that you complied. We need evidence. And so that has driven these companies to do what we call augmented controls and adopting tools from the automotive industry, although that's had challenges too. Our volumes tend to be low, and we want to do as much as these automotive manufacturers can command from their supply base. But all that to say, you want to drive controls to your supplier, you want to develop their processes, but where it's a challenge for us to get on site with these companies and do that work, it is going to drive us as manufacturers of medical devices to sharply look or reevaluate our compensating controls. And that's what we're doing within our own facility. And that could include increasing product inspection, looking at the risk to patient for us not being able to collect certain documents or perform on-site audits with our suppliers. And how do we mitigate that through our compensating controls?
I see. So there's lots of work for companies that have an established QMS, have products on the market through a 510K or a PMA to kind of reduce the risk that's created by the fact that that COVID stops them from going on site, doing certain things that they used to be doing, right? It doesn't just affect the new companies that want to get a product on market, also the ones that have something already running, really.
Yeah, I'd say, Pete, you know, it's a pretty standard practice for manufacturers to audit their suppliers. And I could tell you a lot of my colleagues reached out to me on what do we do now with remote auditing? The reality is we can't do nothing. The FDA is not going to be accepting, you know, several months down the road when we get inspected that we just postponed all our auditing activities, our monitoring activities until the pandemic ends. So a lot of companies I work with are not prepared for remote audits. So it's a new area that we need to work on.
Yeah, yeah. We talked a little bit about the PEUA, right? And the Q subs, but I understand that they're also kind of coming under stress. Under stress meaning you used to be able to get one in 45 days. Now you got to wait a lot longer. It's not as fast anymore as it used to be.
I would say that there's not a timetable. I mean, you get the acknowledgement letter very quickly. You'll know what your number is within 48 hours or less. But as far as the timetable, how you can schedule and calendar your interaction, you can't really know for sure. It really comes down to the complexity of what it is that you're submitting and the ability of the review staff to really comprehend exactly what it is that you're submitting. So that comes down to the quality of the submission as well. And if it's confusing or there's contradictory information, pieces of information in there, it could influence the speed at which the pre-EUA is reviewed, much less the EUA itself.
Gotcha. And Allison, do you have experience with that? I'm sure you asked for pre-subs and all that in the last 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, are you asking for the PUA or
yeah, whether that goes as fast and as smooth as it used to go in the past?
We've had a few pre-submissions get pushed back a little bit. You know, they've said we can't meet that 75 day deadline for our feedback. I mean, for the PUA, they even say in that first acknowledgement letter, like, if you haven't heard back from us in a week, please email us again. You know, it was said last week from a former FDA reviewer. She said, you know, the squeaky wheel does kind of get the attention. So, you know, within reason, you don't want to be pestering your lead reviewer or, you know, the CDRH non-diagnostic templates, you know, email account every, you know, hour, but you definitely can reach out to them and, you know, ask them, what's the status of this project? Like, you know, do you need anything from us to move the ball forward?
Right. Okay. So
I want to make one quick comment, though. I think it's important to note that these reviewers are facing an enormous workload. And so a lot of people think, well, you know, historically, I can reach in and talk to this person at will. And I don't understand why I'm not getting the usual responsiveness. It's because there's nothing usual about what's happening there right now. People working from home, you can't call them at their desk because their desk is not, they're not at their desk, they're at their house. So even setting up an informal call for 5 minutes or something like that takes about a day just to get through the WebEx system and have them use their home computer for the phone call that you're used to maybe having casually. So all this is just a different situation altogether.
Now, if you have a regular product, it has nothing to do with COVID, right? So really nothing much changed, except for the time frame in which your submission gets reviewed, or are there other things that you think have changed that you should pay attention to as a company?
They have given some feedback on timeline. Oh, sorry, Shep. They have given some timelines, you know, for responses. So, you know, they have said, especially during the declaration, they were allowing companies an extra 30 days to respond to hold letters. You know, they are pulling reviewers in from different groups. I know, as I mentioned, like some reviewers have told us flat out, like, listen, I'm being deployed to a different office to try and support, you know, and fill in extra seats there. So I'm no longer your lead reviewer. So there's been a lot of shift at the agency of just, you know, people moving around and trying to support each other. Yeah, I would say just be aware that, you know, that they're all trying the best they can over on that side to get the responses back.
Yeah. Anything you wanted to add, Shep?
Yeah, basically, I just want to say, I mean, there's not some big staff of people, some cohort that just, you know, was bussed in to support the FDA during this time of crisis. It's the same exact people that are used to doing the 510Ks and the PMAs and all these reviews that are being cross-decked and put into the emergency use authorization review. So this staff, I mean, as we're saying, as Allison's alluding, I mean, there are impacts, indirect impacts, direct impacts. And I've been, in fact, I've got a PMA going through right now where the review staff is basically doing a sort of a game of musical chairs. Who's going to get a little bit of chance to do the review while the other people are pulled over to do the emergency use authorizations. And so it really, to think that there would be an impact would be inappropriate.
Yeah. I have two more questions. And so if the audience has more questions, please put them through, otherwise we won't get to them. The first one, Jesse, for you, and the other panelists also can answer this, right? So one of the people asked a ventilator that had been delivered, right, not under a QMS system because the EUA allowed to deliver without a QMS. Is that going to have to be shut down when the EUA is over, or what?
So I would say that this goes back to the need for a QMS, quality management system, because your company needs to be prepared on how to intake, investigate, and respond to customer complaints. And certainly under an emergency situation and getting the products out to market is one thing, but I certainly expect that the FDA will intervene at some point. In fact, even if you do not respond to those sort of complaints or issues in the field, they could go directly to the FDA, and that could prompt FDA action on your facility.
Yeah. Somebody asked whether the EUA is going to go beyond October 2020. I think we've answered that already. We don't know when it's going to be over. We know it's not going to be 2 months from now, but it could be years before it's over, right? I have a last question. The clinical side, the clinical trial side, right? So some of the companies are established or they're in a clinical trial. Things are not as easy now that with the COVID situation. You know, how flexible is the FDA on the clinical side? If any of you can answer that question. I know you're not clinical folks, but you do deal with those kind of situations, I'm sure.
Sorry, Mike, there we go. Are you talking about just clinical for diagnostics or for all devices?
In general, if you have a clinical trial running, right, and all of a sudden your monitors can't go out, or maybe you don't have enough patients signing up and that kind of stuff.
Right, so there is a guidance document that they released to try to help you know, industry figure out what's the best way to move forward with clinical studies. Same thing for, I think, for cancer drug products as well. FDA's released guidance on that. It's pretty harrowing. I have a lot of clients that you know, have active clinical studies that require patients to go, or subjects to go into the hospitals, and some of them, one of them had 700 pediatric subjects enrolled and had to shut down. And it's just, you know, when you think about how important a lot of these technologies are and moving forward, and also for the company, you know, it can really make or break a company, right? If you have to shut down your clinical study, I've had 2 clients call up and say, listen, we're shuttering our doors because we had to close the clinical study. All the investors, you know, have turned away thanks to, you know, the fact that we can't continue our study. So FDA is allowing companies to be a little more creative with how they monitor and how they, you know, will they allow telehealth visits? You know, is it something that, you know, can that deviation be easily implemented and, you know, adequately documented so you can, you know, write that up and still have it stick when you go in with your pre-market submission.
Yeah,
so it's not easy, and it's not ooh, sorry, there's an echo. But there are ways to move forward, and FDA is trying to be understanding and dynamic with that whole process.
Okay. Well, we can go
I'll just
on
say
for a lot longer.
you're not alone. The IRBs are also working closely with clinicians, and you know, everyone's trying to figure out how to support clinical research during this time, and so it's not all on the sponsor. I mean, everyone's trying to figure out how to protect patients during this time while enabling clinical research to proceed.
And I would add on clinical trials, as far as I've seen or just following the news, is we know that the FDA has done an expanded access program, and that's kind of widening the opportunity for you to take protocols and spread them across multiple companies and kind of have that info sharing. But even the recent developments of promoting plasma as a solution or a remedy for, or a treatment, if you will, for COVID is an extension of that program. But, you know, before we get too excited, I know that the FDA lowers or is a little bit more accepting of a lower effectiveness rate given the emergency, but there's been other products that you know, like the hydroxychloroquine, I think it was, that product was also, you know, released under a EUA from a lot of anecdotal or just you know, feedback from physicians that, you know, suggested it was effective, but later that EUA was revoked when more data came in and showed that it didn't prove to be effective. So I think, you know, back to your question, Pete, is that, you know, the FDA is certainly trying to, you know, do what they can to fit the need in the emergency situation, but they could easily, you know, as we collect more data, things could change and they could reverse course.
I think our time has come. Do we still have time, Karen, for a 30-second wrap-up by everybody? Okay, Shep, you first.
Well, thank you. And I just want to say there's so much to think about. We're just getting to the point of where we can talk about routine, you know, in front of the FDA. I mean, it's been so dynamic. So now we're starting to see things settle into patterns, certain timelines that are carrying forward. And it's a new day right now. I would also say that in a time of crisis, we see amazing innovation. So this is I would say, the silver lining of this dark cloud that is COVID-19.
Thank you, Shep. Allison?
Yeah, no, I just want to say thank you to everyone, and I appreciate the topic that we're talking about today, because as I mentioned, this is we're kind of living through a huge regulatory shift right now, and seeing where we all fall out, and, you know, how this all shakes out in a year, 2 years time. I think it'll make regulations, I don't know, maybe a little more dynamic. People will be a little more willing to embrace digital health and digital technologies. I felt like the technology has been there for a long time, but FDA was a little nervous to be open about those technologies. So I think that we've seen the forced shift to happen. That's happened very quickly. So it's very scary times, but also exciting, I guess, in some way.
And Jesse.
Yes, Pete. I too appreciate everyone's time and attention to this, and this discussion that we've had together. It's very relevant. It's fastly evolving. And if any last comment I could say is that although it is just great to see that the FDA is speeding up and using technology to open new opportunities for innovation and getting products to market, these are things we should take advantage of. However, just let's keep in mind that if we move too quickly, we could pay the consequences down the road. So, you know, that's kind of the ongoing theme here from my perspective is, you know, I've worked with a lot of PMA changes down the road, you know, when we decide we want to change a specification. But it's all, if we do it right the first time and we set it up correctly the first time, it's gonna set us up for the future after we're out of this emergency.
All right. Well, it leaves me to thank all the panelists for your contribution. Thank you very much.